In the spring of 1483, the Kingdom of England was shaken to its core. King Edward IV, once the towering symbol of Yorkist strength and royal legitimacy, lay dead at just 40 years old. His sudden passing, after years of war and intrigue, left a power vacuum that no one was fully prepared to fill. His heir, Edward, Prince of Wales, was a boy only 12 years old, intelligent, well-bred, but far too young to rule. In his final days, Edward IV had named his brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, as Lord Protector, a man widely regarded as loyal, sober-minded, and deeply devoted to the stability of the crown. But with the king gone, old rivalries resurfaced like weeds in a neglected garden. The Queen Dowager, Elizabeth Woodville, feared what the future might hold for her sons. She knew court politics. She had seen how fast loyalties could shift, and how sharp the dagger behind a smile could be. Richard of Gloucester acted swiftly. Before the Queen's family could consolidate power, he intercepted the young king, who had been journeying from Ludlow to London with a small retinue. The boy was placed in the Tower of London, not yet a prison in public perception, but rather a fortified royal residence where monarchs traditionally prepared for their coronations. At first, few raised an eyebrow. The move was legal. The gesture seemed protective. Richard reassured everyone Edward V would be crowned in due time. Soon after, young Richard, Duke of York, Edward's 9-year-old brother, was summoned and joined him in the Tower. It was said the brothers were reunited, happily unaware of the storm building around them. But outside the fortress walls, tensions rose like smoke from a hidden fire. Then came the whispers. A cleric named Ralph Shaw gave a sermon claiming that King Edward IV had been pre-contracted to another woman before marrying Elizabeth Woodville. If true, that would render their children, including the young king, illegitimate. Parliament, ever responsive to political winds, passed a document known as Titulus Regius. It declared that Edward V and his siblings had no legal claim to the throne, and just like that, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, became King Richard III. On July 6, 1483, Richard was crowned. The boys remained inside the tower. At first, they were seen playing in the courtyard. Then they were glimpsed only at a distance. And then nothing, silence. No one knows exactly when the boys were last seen. But by late summer, the nation began to ask questions. The princes, rightful heirs, symbols of legitimacy had disappeared from public view, and Richard's silence spoke louder than any proclamation. Was it protection, political necessity, or something more sinister? The tower's gates had closed, and the shadows had begun to fall. In the summer of 1483, the ground beneath the English crown shifted once again. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, who had sworn loyalty to his nephew Edward V, was no longer just a protector. He was now the king. But how did a trusted uncle, admired for his honor and service, transform into Richard III? A monarch surrounded by suspicion, rumor, and fear. It began quietly, with a sermon one few in the kingdom expected. From the pulpit, Dr. Ralph Shaw proclaimed that King Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been unlawful. The late king, it was said, had promised himself to another woman before marrying Elizabeth. This pre-contract meant that all their children, including young Edward and Richard, were illegitimate. It was a bombshell. Almost immediately, Parliament convened and ratified Titulus Regius, a document that legally declared the two princes unfit to inherit the crown. Their royal blood, once the foundation of their right to rule, was now dismissed by ink, wax, and political will. Within days, Richard of Gloucester emerged not as protector, but as sovereign. On July 6, 1483, he was crowned King of England in a grand ceremony at Westminster Abbey. To his supporters, it was a moment of necessary order. To others, a usurpation hidden behind legal formality. Meanwhile, the two boys remained in the Tower of London. At first, there were sightings. Visitors to the tower claimed to have seen them in the garden or looking from windows. They were dressed in fine clothes, still cared for as royal children. But those glimpses soon faded. By late summer, they were seen no more. Then the rumors began. Some whispered that Richard had ordered their deaths, quietly, without fuss. so their claims would never challenge his own. Others insisted they had simply been hidden, perhaps in another royal household or a foreign court. Still others believed they were already dead, and Richard was covering up an unfortunate end to their short lives. But no statement was ever made, no explanation offered. The royal court remained silent, and the silence spoke volumes. Richard had enemies now, former allies turned cold. Elizabeth Woodville and her supporters seethed in quiet defiance. The disappearance of the princes hung like a shadow over the new king's throne. Had Richard acted out of fear? Did he truly believe the princes posed a threat? Or was it power, naked and irresistible, that drove him, whatever the truth? His reign was born under a cloud. The public grew uneasy. The mystery deepened, and the Tower of London, once a place of royal safety, had become a chamber of secrets in the hearts of the people. Something dark had entered the crown. By the end of summer in 1483, the excitement of Richard III's coronation had dimmed, replaced by a chilling question, whispered in corners of court and tavern alike. Where were the princes, Edward V, rightful king by blood, and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, had not been seen in weeks. At first, there were vague reassurances, then silence, and then something colder than silence, absence. No proclamations were issued, no courtly events or family updates, no signs of illness, injury, or escape. The tower, where they had once played in the courtyard, now gave up no trace of its royal wards. Londoners who once glimpsed them from windows saw only stone. The boys had vanished, and yet the realm continued. Richard III ruled. He toured his kingdom, held councils, granted favors. But the air was growing thin. A shadow trailed him. Suspicion had begun to breathe in every corridor of power. The silence surrounding the princes was no longer seen as protective. It had become damning. Rumors swelled like storm clouds. Some claimed the boys had been murdered in their sleep, suffocated with pillows, silenced forever. Others whispered that poison had done the deed, or that hired assassins had crept into their chamber on a moonless night. There was even talk that they had been drowned in wine, a cruel echo of previous Plantagenet bloodshed. But most terrifying of all was the possibility that nothing had been done, that the boys were left to waste away, quietly, without kindness or witness, behind locked doors. And who would dare commit such a crime? All eyes turned to Richard. He had the motive there. Claims to the throne outweighed his own, even with Parliament's decree. He had the means. The tower was under his control, guarded by men loyal to his reign. And he had the opportunity. The boys were isolated, vulnerable, and completely within his grasp. Yet something didn't quite fit. Why remain silent? Why not reveal their deaths publicly? To crush rebellion before it sparked? Why allow the rumors to grow unless the truth was even worse than the whispers? Some believed Richard had not ordered the deed, that someone else had acted in ambition or fear. Others held out hope that the boys were alive, hidden for their safety. But as months passed, hope dwindled. Their mother, Elizabeth Woodville, who once sought their return, made peace with Richard, possibly realizing her sons were already lost. And the people grew uneasy. The story had stopped making sense. The silence was too loud. The crown to bloodless. The princes, once the kingdom's brightest hope, had become its darkest mystery. And from that point on, Richard's crown would carry the weight of two missing children. The disappearance of the princes shook the foundations of Richard III's reign. Though no charges were laid and no confessions heard, the court of public opinion began to tighten its grip around the new king's crown. Still, as the silence stretched and the mystery deepened, a new possibility began to take shape. What if Richard wasn't the killer? What if someone else had moved in the shadows? Enter Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, once Richard's closest ally. He had helped orchestrate the new king's rise to power. But ambition rarely rests quietly. Just months after Richard's coronation, Buckingham suddenly turned rebel, leading a failed uprising against the very king he had helped entrone. What changed? Some historians suggest Buckingham hoped to place himself closer to the throne, perhaps even upon it. With the princes gone, the line of succession had narrowed. Others speculate he acted out of conscience, that he had knowledge of the boy's fate, and sought to distance himself from the crime. Most intriguing of all is the theory that Buckingham, acting independently or without Richard's consent, ordered the deaths of the princes to curry favor, or to erase them from the game entirely. He was executed in November 1483, just months after the boys vanished. If he held the secret, he took it with him to the grave. But the circle of suspects doesn't end there. Across the channel, in the French court, another man watched events unfold with careful eyes. Henry Tudor, the last serious Lancastrian claimant. Henry had lived in exile for years, awaiting a moment to strike. The disappearance of the princes and the tarnish on Richard's reign offered him the perfect opportunity. From Brittany, Henry plotted his return. With growing support from disillusioned Yorkists and Lancastrian loyalists alike, he raised an army and vowed to marry Elizabeth of York, the prince's sister, uniting the houses and healing the nation. But there was a problem. So long as Edward V or his brother lived, Henry's claim remained precarious. Two missing boys were a threat to both York and Lancaster. Could he have played a role? Some believe that after Bosworth, Henry ensured the princes' deaths were never fully investigated because he already knew what had happened, or because he had a hand in it. Upon seizing the throne in 1485, one of his first acts was to issue a law repealing Titulus Regius, the statute that had declared the princes illegitimate. Not only did he reverse it, he ordered all copies destroyed. It became a crime to even mention it. Why such urgency to silence the past? Was it shame, guilt, or simply strategy? Even if Henry didn't kill the boys, their absence served his purpose. With Richard dead and the princes gone, he could claim a clean slate, a dynasty forged not by inheritance, but by conquest. History may never know who gave the order, or if there was ever one at all, but the list of those who stood to gain from the princes' deaths was longer than many care to admit. And in a world where power was everything, innocence was often the first casualty. Nearly 2 centuries had passed. Kings had come and gone. The Tudor dynasty had risen, ruled, and crumbled. And yet, the mystery of the princes in the tower lingered, unspoken, unsolved, and unresolved. Then, in 1674, an accident during routine maintenance at the Tower of London unearthed something chilling. While demolishing a stone staircase in the White Tower, near the chapel of St. John, workmen stumbled upon a wooden chest hidden deep within the rubble. Inside lay the skeletal remains of 2 children, small, twisted, jumbled together beneath centuries of stone. There was no name, no coffin, no inscription. Only silence. The discovery sent shockwaves through England. Could these be the remains of Edward V and his brother Richard, the long-lost princes whose fate had haunted the monarchy? Since 1483, King Charles II thought so. He ordered the bones removed with ceremony and interred in Westminster Abbey, the royal mausoleum. There, they were laid in an urn inscribed with a stark declaration that these were the children believed to have been murdered by their uncle, Richard III. A monument was erected. The public, starved for closure, accepted the finding. The tower had given up its secret. The mystery, it seemed, was solved. But not everyone was convinced. The bones were not examined until 1933, over 150 years after their discovery. At that time, an expert panel conducted a forensic analysis. They confirmed that the remains belonged to 2 children of roughly the right ages, one approximately 12, the other 9 or 10. The conclusions were compelling, but incomplete. The bones had not been thoroughly preserved. The context of the burial, haphazard and unceremonious, left more questions than answers. And the forensic tools of the 1930s were crude by today's standards. No DNA analysis, no isotope testing, no modern pathology. Even more troubling was the fact that no permission has ever been granted to re-examine the bones. Using today's technology, requests to reopen the urn, to extract DNA and compare it to known royal remains, have been repeatedly denied by both the monarchy and the Church of England. Why? Some say it's out of respect. Others claim it's because there's nothing to be gained, that the truth, even if revealed, changes nothing. But perhaps it's something else. Perhaps the monarchy has no desire to stir ghosts long buried. Perhaps certainty would demand consequences. A public reckoning that England's history isn't ready to face. So the bones remain in their tomb. They lie in a dark corner of Westminster Abbey, overlooked by tourists, passed by thousands. But to those who still wonder, still ask, still search, they are a silent monument to what was lost. 2 children, buried without name, to princes, taken without justice, and one truth, still waiting to be unearthed. A decade passed after Richard III's fall, a decade of uneasy peace under Henry VII. And then, from the ashes of rumor, came a spark that reignited the nation's oldest fear. What if one of the princes had survived? In the year 1491, a young man appeared in the court of Margaret of Burgundy, sister of the late King Edward IV and aunt to the vanished princes. He claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the 2 boys who had disappeared in the Tower of London 8 years before. His name was Perkin Warbeck, or so we thought. Tall, refined, articulate, he spoke with elegance and authority. He seemed intimately familiar with the Yorkist court, its customs, its people, its secrets. Too many, it seemed impossible he could know so much unless he had lived it. Margaret of Burgundy believed him, so did many in the courts of Europe. France, Scotland, and the Holy Roman Empire offered support. To them, Warbeck wasn't a pretender. He was a prince. The lost son had returned. But for Henry VII, this was no romantic tale. It was a threat, a dagger aimed at the heart of his carefully constructed Tudor dynasty. If Warbeck was truly Richard, Duke of York, then Henry's crown was forfeit. And if he wasn't, then why did so many believe him? Warbeck's cause gained traction. In 1497, he led an invasion into England, landing in Cornwall, though poorly supported. It terrified the Tudor regime, the public, wearied by heavy taxation and longing for Yorkist stability. Stirred with curiosity, some even rallied to his banner. But the rebellion failed. Warbeck was captured, paraded through the streets of London, and imprisoned in the Tower, the very place where the real Richard had vanished. For a time, Henry kept him alive. Perhaps he hoped Warbeck would confess to being an impostor. Perhaps he feared what might come if he executed a man some still believed was the rightful king. Eventually, Warbeck was forced into a confession, likely under pressure, in which he admitted to being the son of a Flemish official. He claimed to have been coached in court manners, taught noble lineage, and trained to impersonate a prince, and yet, doubts persisted. Some believed the confession was scripted, a Tudor fabrication. Others whispered that Warbeck's bearing, his fluency in court ritual, his resemblance to Edward IV, all were too precise to be mere mimicry. Even among his enemies, there were those who quietly asked, what if? In 1499, after an alleged escape attempt, Warbeck was hanged. The final chapter closed on the last living echo of the Tower mystery, but his story left a scar. For the rest of Henry VII's reign, and into the reign of his son, Henry VIII, the fear of Yorkist return, the ghost of a forgotten prince, would haunt every corner of the Tudor court. Was Perkin Warbeck an audacious fraud, or the last, desperate voice of a boy stolen from history? Whatever the truth, his brief rebellion proved one thing: the mystery of the princes in the Tower still had power. Power to inspire, power to threaten, power to shake a dynasty built on buried secrets. Centuries have passed since the princes vanished into the stone silence of the Tower, and yet their story has never faded. If anything, it has grown, evolving from political tragedy into myth, legend, and symbol. But how did we come to know what we believe? Much of what the world thinks it knows about the princes in the Tower comes from a single theatrical voice, William Shakespeare. In his famous play Richard III, the playwright crafted a figure of monstrous ambition, a hunchbacked villain who murders his own nephews to steal the crown. It is one of the most chilling portrayals in English literature, but it is also Tudor propaganda. Shakespeare was writing for the court of Elizabeth I, granddaughter of Henry VII, the man who defeated Richard III. In that world, Richard had to be the villain. It served the Tudor narrative. It justified their rise. It sanitized a bloody past, and so Richard became history's scapegoat. But strip away the stage, the crown, the melodrama, and we are left with a much more complicated picture. Historical accounts from Richard's own time paint him not as a tyrant, but as a thoughtful, even reform-minded ruler. He introduced laws to protect landowners from corrupt nobles, pushed for translations of legal documents into English, and promoted merit over noble birth. Could such a man really have ordered the quiet murder of 2 children? Some modern historians think not. They argue that Richard had little to gain by killing the princes once he was king. Their threat, already neutralized by Titulus Regius, may have been more useful to him alive than dead. Their sudden deaths, after all, only ignited rebellion, and gave Henry Tudor his rallying cry. Others suggest Richard may have ordered the boys hidden, for protection, or political leverage, and that their disappearance was later exploited by enemies, or unforeseen tragedy, illness, secret assassination by a rival, even Buckingham acting without Richard's consent. And then, there are those who still point the finger at Henry VII himself. If the boys survived into his reign, if they were ever found or revealed, his entire claim to the throne would collapse. Henry had every reason to ensure they were never heard from again. His destruction of Titulus Regius and his ruthless suppression of Yorkist claimants hint at a deeper fear or guilt. In the absence of evidence, the truth becomes a battlefield. Each theory tells us as much about the teller as it does the tale. Was Richard a tyrant or a victim of history? Were the Tudors liberators or architects of a lie? There are no clear answers. The facts are few, the bones buried, the tower silent. But the story endures, not because we know what happened, but because we don't, because the mystery, the absence, the uncertainty speaks louder than history ever could. The Tower of London still stands, its walls weathered, its stones cold with memory, to millions. It is a tourist attraction, a fortress of kings, a relic of medieval grandeur. But to some, it is a tomb, a silent sentinel to one of England's oldest unsolved crimes. The story of the princes in the tower has become more than a question of guilt. It is a parable, a symbol of lost innocence, political cruelty, and the veiled brutality of monarchy. Edward V and Richard, Duke of York, were not simply royal children. They were the last hope of a shattered dynasty, and their disappearance marked the true end of the House of York. After 1483, nothing was ever quite the same. Richard III's brief reign collapsed under the weight of suspicion and rebellion. His death at Bosworth Field sealed the rise of the Tudors, but the crown they seized was haunted. Even as Henry VII established peace, he did so with silence, sealing away the past, destroying documents and punishing speech. The story of the princes, who they were, what they meant, and what became of them, was buried as carefully as their bones. Over time, the narrative twisted into legend. Chroniclers, playwrights, and historians shaped them into symbols. To some, they became martyrs of York. To others, tragic footnotes to a darker tale. And always, they remained missing. No definitive evidence has ever emerged. No written confession, no death certificate, no trial, just whispers, just possibilities. A staircase, a box of bones, a boy claiming to be Richard, and an empire built on absence. The tower guards its secrets well. The room where the princes last lived, if it still exists, is locked, silent. The bones, believed to be theirs, lie sealed in Westminster Abbey, untouched by modern science. Requests to test them, to prove once and for all whether they are the missing sons of Edward IV, have been denied. Respect for the dead, they say, or perhaps fear of what the truth might disturb. Because maybe, just maybe, to confirm the truth would mean confronting the lies, the throne, the dynasties, the celebrated victories, all traced back to a pair of vanished boys. If we found them, what else would we unearth? And so, the mystery remains. Every year, visitors walk through the tower's thick corridors. They gaze up at the windows where the boys may have watched the sky. They pass the chapel, the staircase, the garden, and whether they know it or not, they walk through a crime scene. The story of the princes in the tower is not about what we know. It's about what we refuse to forget. To children walked into a fortress. Neither was ever seen again. And for over 500 years, Their shadows have never left.